Thank you so much, Nigel. We'd ask you to just take a seat on the stage, because your time with us, your speaking to us, is not yet finished, because we're now going to have you joined on stage by a panel and an opportunity for you, ladies and gentlemen, to present some questions to Nigel and also to his fellow panellists. And we'll just get the others up on stage first. Jonathan, Alex Penk, and that's it, is it? Oh, sorry, I thought there was going to be one more as well. So I will be more than happy for people from the floor to ask the questions, probably to Nigel. I'm sure Jonathan and Alex have got a few words to, a few questions for Nigel as well. But let's throw it open to the floor. Sir, would you like to stand, tell us who you are, and shout very loudly, because we don't have
microphones.
microphones.
Will come around for you.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, my name is Stephen Taylor. I am heading into the Master in Legal Studies next year at the University of Auckland. I was curious that Professor Biggar and Jonathan had a meeting with the Auckland University 2 days ago. I'm also mindful the University of Auckland's been having quite a struggle in terms of defining free speech on campus. In fact, they've been spending 4 years doing it. So I'd be very grateful as a master's student going in next year as to what was the result of the meeting. Thank you.
We continue to have relatively open doors with many vice-chancellors and senior administration figures with universities around the country. We often don't agree, but we are having fruitful conversations. What we're able to do now, though, is go in with a carrot and a stick, really, because we're having conversations with them, but also in the relatively final stages of working with Ministers Penny Simmons, the Minister of Tertiary Education, and Minister David Seymour, in terms of developing new structure in the Education and Training Act to defend academic freedom. And so these codes that have been developed around the country, as you say, University of Auckland spent 4 years deciding whether they really thought academics should be allowed to speak or not. It turns out they're not too certain. And what this means is that actually they will be told what the structure has to be. The legislation has still been refined. It hasn't gone through Cabinet yet. And while I am relatively commended, I think we're commended in the work that the Vice-Chancellors are so outraged that the government is looking at finally calling them into line, they're a relatively significant constituency and will probably dig their heels in a little bit. So I guess in essence the story isn't over yet. We are continuing to fight there, and academic freedom and free speech within the tertiary education sector is only becoming more of a salient issue. And so I think more people in everyday life and more professors and administrators on campuses are invested in this work. So I think we're headed in the right direction.
Could I just supplement that? I know that the legislation, the prospective legislation, is controversial. Some people think if it were enacted, it could easily be captured by the other side. But I suspect, this is speculation, I suspect the prospect of such a legislation made the University of Auckland more willing to talk, because they see this as a threat. So I suspect that was a factor in that meeting.
And it sounds like you should attend the academy panel discussion. but if I can point out, we have a collection of professors here, mostly from the University of Auckland, but from Massey and others here as well. One of the questions I would like to discuss with Nigel shortly is around courage. And there are individuals here who have displayed the most remarkable and admirable courage. And I think we should give them a round of applause now, because they are the reason this is progressing.
Next question from the floor, if we could get the microphone to... Oh, sorry, you'll be next, all right? Okay, front row, sir, with the beard.
Okay, Peter Schwartfeger from Massey University. I have been cancelled, and I had even a serious misconduct case against me because I criticized the provost because of her policies, just to let you know. I think this kind of problem of academic freedom is you find it at all universities, by the way, in New Zealand. And there are probably some worse ones, some of the worst ones, and I believe probably Auckland and Massey University in that category. But my question goes because of the Royal Society. Our Royal Society has been captured to my opinion, by ideology and by these kind of noisy minorities. How is the Royal Society in the UK doing? Because I mean, they should be there to protect academic freedom and academic scholarship, right? Can you answer that?
I'm not really sure. The Royal Society, of course, deals with natural science. I'm not a scientist, so I don't keep my eyes on what they're doing. If I do remember rightly, I mean, the case of the Royal Society here came to my attention because of, was it the teaching of Maori law as equal to science in schools, is that right?
Mātauranga Māori knowledge, yeah.
Maori knowledge, okay. If I remember rightly, there were a number of scientists in Britain who wrote in support of those protesting against that. But that, of course, is not a problem that the Royal Society in England faces directly. But there are plenty of people in Britain, not least Richard Dawkins, who have spoken vociferously against the notion that Maori knowledge. I'm a religious person, so I think the religious myths may well contain existential, human, and even religious truths, but they're not natural science. And so the idea of teaching them as if they were equal in terms of science is not appropriate. If I understand correctly, what is being done and what is proposed here. But to answer your question, I don't think the Royal Society in Britain is facing the same kind of problem. Now, whether, of course, I had assumed that decolonization, for example, was something that would only affect the arts and sciences, arts and humanities. Not so. I had a young Greek scholar come and complain to me that Oxford zoology is being decolonized. So it may well be the issue of decolonization is on the Royal Society's agenda. Whether there's any protest against it, I don't know.
It's worth noting that Peter is one of New Zealand's most celebrated academics, and internationally he is a world-leading mathematician. Silencing Peter and censoring Peter really does come quite close to the implications of censoring Galileo, kind of in that sort of... and the idea of decolonizing maths is not foreign in many universities.
Can I jump in and offer a reflection? I'm not sure if I can quite match the Galileo stakes, but I see your Galileo, and I'll raise you some virtue. One of the things that really strikes me about what Nigel shared with us today, and Jonathan's actually touched on the topic of courage, is that it's really it's an exemplar. In other words, it's a story that we can learn something from, kind of like a parable, which we can then apply in our own contexts. And one of the things that it made me think was that it actually, to me, exemplifies the virtue of love. And that might sound like a funny thing to say in a context where people advancing kind of contrary views are often referred to as haters, bigots, engaging in serious shit. But I'm drawing here on an idea promoted by the medieval philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas, who said that to love is to actively will the good of another. And what strikes me about a story like Nigel's and many of the stories that I know are represented in this room is that it's actually a commitment to truth, but also to the good that truth represents, precisely for the sake of others who may not be able to pursue it themselves. It's sometimes also what's called charity or agape. It's a kind of a self-sacrificial love, and I think you hear that in Nigel's story. At least his wife recognising that he was devastated, even if he didn't. But that sort of has two implications to me. One is that we need to get beyond just the sort of insipid idea of kindness that we've heard quite a lot about in the last few years, which I think is just incredibly thin and offers very little. But beyond that, I think there's sort of a... It's not just that if you're doing what Nigel's doing, you are not hateful. You are actually engaging in an act of love, in concern for your neighbour. And I really think there's... one of the things we can learn from that example is sort of a permission to reclaim the moral high ground. And so, yeah, I'm grateful to Nigel for bringing that to our attention.
Can I add to that? So Alex has put his finger on something really important, because I've been moved to wonder what courage is. And I don't think anyone intends to be courageous. That what moves really is there's something you really care about, and you just can't stand to see it defamed or damaged anymore, so you act, and you take risks. I care about my country. Doesn't mean I love everything about it. Because you care about something means it can disappoint you enormously. But I care about it. I care very much not to see its reputation slandered and distorted, and I care very much about those who rule us not being so burdened by imaginary guilt that they start to distort policy and give away bits of territory in the Chagos Islands they shouldn't, just because they feel guilty. So I care about these things, and that's why I acted. And I think Alex is right. It's love for something so strong you can't bear to see it defamed or damaged anymore, so you act.
Has there been much of an industry in statue repairs in the UK, Nigel, recently, or not?
No, I haven't got to that stage yet. Just statue removal is where we've got to.
All right. Next question.
Question over the side of the room. Sorry, Peter.
Yeah.
Just on the left here.
Oh, sorry. There's a woman in the middle row, but we'll get to her shortly. Yeah, with the light blue sweater, cardigan. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. From the left-hand side of the room. My name is Rima Vaidyanathan. I'm a professor at Auckland University of Technology, and I was part of a committee brought together to develop our campus policy on speech. And I always say I felt less free than in that room discussing it, because it seemed to be very emphasized, the idea of protection of people from sort of what you would class hateful speech. And unfortunately, I don't have the same courage as Professor Biggar and others. I just drifted away because I have other areas of my research which are really controversial, so I have enough to defend without having to get emboldened into this area. But I was concerned about the latest government's move to require all universities to have such a policy, because I saw how such policies were developed from the inside, and I don't actually know that we're advancing free speech on campus by requiring our senior leadership to develop such policies, because to be honest, I felt if we hadn't that policy, I'd be more free than in the face of such policy. So.
I think you're absolutely correct, and this is a key issue the Free Speech Union has regularly raised, not least of all with Minister Seymour's office. When news began to circulate that eventually universities would be required to advance these codes, a lot of universities began to implement themselves. And so, for example, in the Auckland University draft policy, the opening statement was with respect to the fact that the University of Auckland is a Te Tiriti-led organisation that is committed to the principles of the treaty. So your position on free speech starts off with, and we will not include dissent or debate on these issues. And through these codes, absolutely, without very strict confines, we will see universities actually do more damage to free speech than actually simply not having these codes at all. Unfortunately, that means the minister is going to then have to very precisely outline what these have to include, and universities begin to have more and more of a legitimate complaint around involvement in institutional autonomy. So it's not easy to see what the precise answer should be here. Certainly letting them do it themselves, though, is not one I think we should pursue. Nigel, do you want to comment on that as to whether you would trust institutions in the UK to hold the line on these issues?
Oh, not alone. No. I mean, some good policies of free speech have been developed. Some bad ones. This sounds like a bad one. But I just note here the concern about protecting students. Well, who can disagree with that? But not protecting them against views they don't like. If a student finds it difficult to live in an environment where people threaten things that are dear to that student, then to serve the welfare of that student, you should help the student to learn resilience, right? It's not helping them, it's not protecting them by giving them temporary shelter from ideas they don't like, because in the big wide world, they're not going to be sheltered. As with hate speech, here we have a wrong interpretation of what protection means, or should mean.
I find it interesting that the concept there is protect rather than respect. as well, because if you think about one of the things that universities are supposed to do, one of the main things I learned at university, including Cambridge, sorry, but was actually the ability to think critically. And unless you can do that, and unless you have been exposed to a range of ideas, including ideas that you don't agree with, you'll never fully develop agency, which is the ability to make meaningful choices and to think for yourself about what is worth choosing. So it sort of seems to me that there's a real risk of infantilizing students in the process.
And I think equally the shift from strength to safety. Actually, instead of making them safe, why don't we make them strong? To be able to withstand pressure, but actually, you know, what do they say? Instead of a weaker burden, ask for a stronger back, and a lighter burden, ask for a stronger back. And I think we are doing great disservice to these students in terms of where they go into in the world.
The irony is, though, gentlemen, in the Education and Training Act of 2020, so it's a relatively new piece of legislation, isn't there a line about academic freedom and about how information and attitudes and opinions can be expressed freely on campus? And it actually says that those opinions must be allowed. So why are we even having this debate?
Because law is not the solution. And so you're absolutely right. The act where that portion of the legislation comes from is from the late 1980s. And I think the academics in this room are largely in one mind that it's a relatively strong piece of legislation. It articulates academic freedom and the crucial role of academic freedom very clearly. And yet the universities have gone, well, bugger that. And there isn't. There's no teeth to the legislation for us to call them in line with that. So that's where there need to be consequences for not following the law, because I think we've been able to demonstrate fairly convincingly that there are blatant breaches of academic freedom occurring. But I think more generally, Peter, it shows that legislation is not the solution. Now, we're very open that legislation needs to be part of our approach, but really this is about promulgating a cultural belief that we are stronger, we are safer, we are better off as a society when we are free to think for ourselves and free to speak. And that produces discomfort at times, but it is better in the long term. The law cannot impose that on us.
All right. Let's take another question from the floor. Lady there.
Okay, my name is Dawn Trenberth, and one of my roles is that I am the co-leader of the Women's Rights Party. But I keep a low profile and let Jill front it because I have a daughter who works for the executive wing of Parliamentary Services, and she's really scared about me getting my name out there. But my actual question relates to my profession as a kindergarten teacher, and there is a document which is the National Education Learning Priorities. So that's a kind of document which is out there. And one of the things it's got in there, it's got a whole lot of stuff in there, and stuff we probably won't necessarily agree with, probably the sorts of things that really affected our professor over here, is that we have to be warm and welcoming to people regardless of their gender identity, including adults. And as a teacher, my concern is for children. So I just think, now what is going to happen if we land up with someone who is going and telling children that this is my pronoun and this is what I think and I'm really a man or I'm really a woman, when you've got young children? Because as a teacher, I would think that's not good for my children. So that's the kind of thing. So what it comes down to is, how do we unpick all the stuff like that which is stuck in our legislation, which makes it really hard for us to operate? Because I think that is actually a huge issue that has to be dealt with. Thank you.
Any comment from the panel about that, Alex?
Yeah, well, the NELPs, the National Education Learning Priorities, have, and this is reflected in the Education and Training Act, various statements in them about needing to provide a safe and inclusive environment and so on. And I was thinking a little bit about the comment Jonathan made a moment ago about law not being the solution. I used to be a lawyer, so I think, well, sometimes law can be the solution. But it's only ever a partial solution, I think. But very, very quickly on that, one of the questions is, well, what do you mean by safe? And when you look at medical and scientific evidence around this topic, for example, and the emerging developmentally informed paths that a number of countries are taking, there's actually really good reason to think that schools and other educational institutions which have an obligation to keep all their students safe should actually be taking a much more cautious and developmentally informed approach to these questions. So in some ways we actually sort of have some legislative tools for advocating for or beginning to promote different approaches. Very quickly, I lead an organisation called Ethos, which works on freedom of conscience and belief. We actually did quite a lot of work around this and published guidelines for schools earlier in the year on this question, which you can find on our website. But I think your question was, how does this change? So I think part of it is looking at the legal tools that we have. I think this is also part of how this changes, and we've talked a little bit about courage already. One of the significant things I think about that is if you think of the word encourage, literally means to put heart into another. And I think that's what a gathering like this can do. I think that's what a testimony, an exemplar kind of story like Nigel's can do. One of the challenges, I guess, that we've got is what Nigel called the mild majority, and a need really for more people to stand up. I wrote some notes in advance of coming here today, and one of the things I wrote was more people need to say what they think, and fully appreciate your daughter's situation. For example, it's not always possible for people to do that. But in the work that we do and the work that I know that the Free Speech Union does, there is, I think, more support available, more opportunities to actually provide air cover for people who need it. And fundamentally, I think, if you reflect on what Nigel said, in the last 4 years, all of these groups, organisations, initiatives that have been started, I think, to me, that's ultimately the answer to how does this turn around. It's really an exercise of creativity. It's not about sitting back and complaining. It's not about critiquing. It's not about just trying to copy other institutions that exist but aren't doing it so well. It's actually about generating new things and recapturing things like the virtue of courage, of love, of sacrifice. And that's not always an easy thing to do, but in a funny way, I think adversity is a stimulus to creativity, and I think that's something we have on our side.
Can I play the role of baddie for a moment? Because both of these erudite and well-spoken men have referenced the fact that we shouldn't expect everyone to have courage, because some people have a greater price to have to pay in that regard than others. I accept that. I also do think many of us often inflate what the cost really will be. And every time we kick a cost down the road, we end up having to pay a higher price next time it comes round. And so, ma'am, I don't mean to make this I don't know the context of your daughter. I don't know what the stakes are really for her. This isn't about anyone's particular circumstance. But I do think it's, and I'm not necessarily saying you're even wrong, but it's an easy thing to say that, of course some people don't want to, but for those of us that can. And I recognize my privilege, of course. You pay me to stand up here and speak out for you, and I am grateful for that. But I also think everyone does have a role to play, and every time we think, oh, well, this would hurt me, would you really lose your job, or would it be a difficult conversation? And would that difficult conversation actually be more worthwhile having now than it would later? I think perhaps at times we can overemphasize, yes, people should have courage, but certainly not me, and then none of us actually end up doing that.
Yeah, and I think that applies in the media as much as anywhere else as well. I mean, in 2021, I walked away. I suppose deep down I could have the courage to go, but I was, 67, 68 years old. My working life was over.
You've hardly fled from the fight, though, have you?
No, I've managed to stay in the fight, that's for sure. But what I'm saying is that if I was 48 years old instead of 68 years old and I had school-aged children, I would have found it very bloody difficult to walk away, because it would have been my responsibility to put food on the table and probably be paying a mortgage. At the time when I did resign, I had no mortgage and no kids, so it was easy to do it. But courage is, sometimes it comes down to the practical things, like our daughter here who works at Parliament. Maybe she needs to feed a family, and sometimes it can be as simple as that. Yeah. Right, from the floor, sir, in the blue shirt.
Sorry, we're just over the side again, Peter.
Oh, sorry.
We're sort of doing a volleyball thing. You're really favouring the right, which I shouldn't be surprised we're in this room. Something from the left, if you may.
Debbie Sheridan. I'm a retired physician, and since 2018 I have been blogging a lot on socio-political issues, largely related to free thought. And my point for the panel and for the room is that academic freedom is very important, But the problem is that academics are oppressed because we, the public, are not being strong enough in indicating online, because you can't do it any other way, that it is important to be able to get your point of view across. To my mind, censorship is one of the big issues. When Jacinda Ardern was Prime Minister, she promoted filtration. I think filtration exists. And I know this because in 2018, I had 11 million people reading my stuff. And now it's a trickle. And I think that that's happening to anybody that actually expresses their own personal point of view. They get labeled as some sort of weirdo, and I'm not a right-winger by any stretch. And it's because the far right and the far left does not want anybody to disagree with them. It's an extremist issue that pushes censorship and the totalitarian delivery of ideas from one end
Are we
or
heading
the
to a
other.
question here?
Yes, the question is New Zealand doing this? Is New Zealand, officially or unofficially, putting pressure on the social media platforms to censor? Because in the end, it's only if we can get our ideas across and there's sufficient numbers that the senior people in the academic settings can realize that there is a large body of people out here who don't go along with that oppressive type of point of view.
The simple answer is, I don't think so anymore. We're absolutely aware of the fact that during COVID, as you pointed out, ma'am, there were active steps by government agencies to go after particular people. And probably most people here won't be surprised by some of the names that were included on a list of people that should be shadow banned. We have no indication to think that that is currently happening under instruction from the government. Of course, we've seen over the past 2 years or so a bifurcation emerge within the online social media platform space between opportunities on X and Meta. So for Meta, absolutely greater moderation and restriction still occurs. That's not an instruction that's occurring from the government, and I would suggest that both the current government and individuals within the public service of the government would be outraged to think that the state would impose itself in that way. Meta is its own problem, and so maybe this is again where we think censorship is not so much a conversation of the government imposing itself on the people, where historically that has been more the case. But we look at these institutions that are probably far more powerful than most governments, like Meta, going actually the ability that they have to control conversations is more significant than any attempt the state of New Zealand has ever made. How are we making sure there is accountability and transparency there? That's a very important conversation.
Can I just offer a thought on social media and the digital public square, which is that it is really important, but it's also not the only thing that's important. I'm thinking particularly of a question from a kindergarten teacher earlier. Jonathan's already referenced 1984. There was a book that was released in the 1980s called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. He was concerned about the impact of television on public discourse, and everything that he said, you can sort of take it and multiply it by 100 times for where we are now. But one of the things that he said was Orwell was concerned about people who wanted to ban books. He referred to another book, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, which is basically about people existing in a state of perpetual amusement, distraction, apathy. He basically said, look, I think actually Huxley was right. Now, personally, I think we've got both things going on, but we are fairly distracted, and people aren't necessarily developing the imagination and the appetite to kind of pursue something that can kind of develop, I think, an understanding of why does free speech matter? Why would I stand up for this thing that might cost me? And there's an argument that I found quite persuasive, and it might have been Professor Elizabeth Rata who said this. If it's not, then I hope she'll forgive me for misattributing it. But it was effectively that if we want people to care about things like free speech and dignity and democracy, those are kind of abstract concepts. to understand abstract concepts, first of all, you have to be able to be exposed to them. You have to recognise them. That requires a certain mental and cognitive process, and one of the ways we typically develop that is by reading. And we're in a country that has just literacy rates falling off cliffs. So if one of the things that we need to do is, yes, the digital public square matters very greatly, but also if we don't address some of these kind of quite fundamental problems, we're going to continue replicating this in the generations to come. Maybe this is just a very long-winded way of saying it's quite complex, I think it's kind of nuanced, and there's lots of things that we need to do.
Gentleman in the blue shirt. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, all of you from the panel. We've got
No. Sorry, sir. We'll get the microphone to you next. Bit of lack of coordination here. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. Question for Professor Biggar. Just really interesting what you've explained to us. The question I have for you is in relation to the people who are trashing the British Empire and trying to stop you from speaking. I guess it's two questions. Where are they coming from? What is the good they think they will try and achieve by doing this? And secondly, why don't they think 2 steps ahead and realise that one day the worm could turn and that their opinions could be cancelled if their methodology is appropriate?
I'm going to stand up because I like to see who I'm talking to. So the critics of the British Empire, as I say, I think what's going on here is a critic of the record of the West, because Britain, before America became leader of the West, Britain was that. And so this is part of a left-wing worldview that the West is really responsible for the woes of the world, the capitalist West, liberal West. I don't think they think very much about what comes after. They're in the business of pulling down. They don't have much idea about what goes up. And they seem to be oblivious to the fact that the liberal West is being threatened by extremely illiberal authoritarian states like China and Russia. That doesn't seem to enter into their equation at all. So my view is, the West, the West was a big thing. The British Empire was a big thing. Yes, it presided over lots of bad things. Yeah, but it also built liberal institutions. I mean, the fact that New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Britain, the US are among the most prosperous and liberal states on earth is not a coincidence. Right? So my argument is not that we were sin-free, but we built really important things that hold governments to account and allow the calling into question of false prevailing ideas, so we don't have our public policy distorted. We suffer from bad public policy in a way that is not the case in China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea. That's really, really important, which is why this matters. As for where the motivation comes from, I mean, there are philosophical grounds, but as my book seeks to demonstrate, time and time again, these academics, and certainly non-academics, do the same thing. Their assertions go way beyond reason, way beyond the evidence. It's propelled way beyond. And the question that I ask is, what's propelling it? So my view is, if your people, if your country has done bad things, then you should admit it. But boy, it should hurt. That my people have done bad things should hurt because they're your people. You identify with them. What I find is with a lot of these folk, including Britons, lots of white people, there's not only a glee attached to listing the sins of the West. When you present contrary evidence, the response is not skeptical curiosity. It's not the presenting of counter reasons. It is aggressive denial. So these people are really invested in this story, and part of me thinks this is not about solving any problem. This is about these people are intoxicated with being crusaders. It's about the ego. It's not about the poor. So, why do I say that, apart from sheer speculation? Well, here's an example. Yes, in 2015-16, you have several hundred students protesting for the downfall of Cecil Rhodes in Oxford, including Rhodes scholars. Right? In fact, the leading Black Road scholar, Ntokosi Kwabi, went back to South Africa to a legal career, and his notoriety in Oxford did his career good. Did he not know that? I think he did. But here's the thing. Whilst they were busy hollering for the downfall of an obscure statue of a long-dead British imperialist, in South Africa, in real time, Jacob Zuma and the ANC are looting the state and driving it to insolvency. And what did these people in Oxford have to say about that? Absolutely nothing. So what did they care about? Not South Africa, for sure. So I think, it's a human thing. We love to be self-righteous, even I do sometimes. Look at me now. Look at me now. I'm on a high. It's a human thing. It's a human thing. But we need to be sure it's good to crusade. It's good to crusade for the poor and oppressed, but not for yourself.
Yeah. All right. Okay, we're going to take questions for about another 10 minutes or so before we break for our panels. Can we finally please get the microphone to the gentleman in the blue shirt in the front row? Thank you.
I'm not sure it's going to be worth it anyway. But from the right, and in the spirit of the reclaiming and regaining the upper thing, when the late unlamented Ardern announced her career, she described herself as a progressive. And we've seen in America as well, where one of the leading authoritarian, totalitarian political parties, and it's not Trump, describe themselves as liberal. I believe we've got to take back liberal as being the word only we are associated with, and that's very fascist, I know. And perhaps we could enforce it as well, but that might be going a little too far.
The corruption of language is at the heart of trying to assume power. Yep. And I think if you look at every, and I don't think this accurately describes any regime we've had here in New Zealand, but if you look overseas at any totalitarian or authoritarian regime, the means by which they initially accomplish that is through corrupting words. They take a word we have an emotional connection with, they hollow it out, replace it with a new meaning so we can associate with the term with an entirely different meaning in place. Now what you're pointing to an extent are cultural differences. The Americans are very simplistic, I don't hold it against them, they try, but what they mostly do is they talk in terms of conservatism and liberalism. So that's partially why we've seen the corruption of that term. But generally, you're also correct that liberal has evolved into quite a contradictory meaning, whether intentionally or not, and it has become something that is fundamentally suppressive, oppressive, illiberal. And I agree. I think that we need to connect again to the core value of liberty, of libertas, of liberalism. The idea that society is animated by individuals, that the individual is the base agent of agency, and that they are free to think for themselves and act according to their beliefs and conscience, up until the point that it interacts with others, liberalism. Now, Alex, I think at times you and I have disagreed slightly on that, but do you have a comment as to...
Dropping me in it, Jonathan.
How do we navigate what are common interests between true liberalism, but then a slightly more conservative bent to that as well?
Well, I think for me, I often start with questions of anthropology. So what is a person? And I think fundamentally one of the things that it is to be a flourishing person is to have that kind of moral agency that I was referring to before, which is the ability to make meaningful decisions, including the ability to make choices that other people might disapprove of, to advance arguments that other people might disagree with, partly because I think unless you have the ability to do that, you're not actually exercising your full humanity. You don't have any opportunity to learn and to grow. So I think that's where I think there's an enormous amount of common ground in terms of the fundamental importance of having that freedom. I think maybe, I don't know if this is a direct response to your question, Jonathan, but in addition to the kind of question about particular terms that we might try and reclaim or reskin, I suppose, again, thinking about Nigel's work, it sort of strikes me that it's not only about terminology, it's almost about like the entire imagination that we bring to public discourse and to our common life. And I mean, I suppose this might sound a little bit like an odd way to put it, but I feel like there's a need to sort of remoralise public debate, public discussion, and I don't mean impose a kind of a moral consensus. What I mean is actually reintroduce a kind of moral vocabulary and a moral imagination, so that rather than having this, I think, incredibly thin discourse where people use words like progressive or kind, and it either means nothing or actually it's a stand-in for a pretty well worked out moral understanding of the world, and it's really just smuggling those ideas in. I think it'd be much better to actually try and reintroduce into public discourse a much sort of fuller fleshed vocabulary to actually welcome that kind of thing in the public square, where I think it is actually it's chased out. There's no space for it for various reasons. I'm sure the media panel is going to talk about that later. And wouldn't it be amazing if the kind of, well, maybe this is just me being a nerd, but wouldn't it be amazing if the kind of question that Jonathan asked, as somebody who's more on the conservative side and somebody who's more on the liberal side, what do we have in common? If those kind of questions were actually more common, more generally, but you've actually got to have an appetite for that and a vocabulary for it.
Building on that further, Nigel and I have discussed it at length this week, our use of the words left and right in terms of the political spectrum, and how I think, at least for my generation, I'm in my 20s, and I think for those of us that are kind of earlier in our careers, this is an entirely inappropriate construct to try and use to distinguish societies, because it's patently clear that free speech is not a left-right political issue. We've already heard commentators from the left and the right here today in terms of what that traditionally means, but we are witnessing a shift that is between authoritarianism and an orientation towards freedom, and then the word we've used in the past for that is liberal. And I think I would encourage many people here to maybe try and it can be easy to reduce it down to left-right, but I don't think that's accurate, I don't think it's articulate, I don't think it's correct, and I think we make enemies or opponents out of those who we don't need to as a result of that. And I think if we actually talk about those that are seeking to use coercion, and censorship is a form of coercion, as opposed to using persuasion, we can disagree on the size of government, or we can disagree on taxation policy, put that to one side, and still accept that as a function within democracy.
All right. I think we'll have one question there and one here, and then we'll take the break, and you'll have a chance to buy Nigel's book as well during the break. But firstly,
Great.
questions on the back.
These have sold out around the country, so I suggest you get over there relatively quickly.
Just a quick question for Professor Biggar, and I'll get straight to it. Is there much sense in having any hope in the Tory party? I mean, it has been nice, I suppose, when they were about to lose power, that they started to do stuff on freedom of speech. But 10, 12 years, presiding over a massive expansion of soft and then hard censorship. I mean, has anything really changed where we might be able to realistically think that they'll do anything when it counts?
Okay, I mean, you're quite right. 14 years of Conservative government in Britain was a pretty mixed bag. The commitment to free speech, no, it lasted several years. I mean, the process of producing the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act was 3-4 years. So the record wasn't that bad. As for the future, I'm delighted to say that the new leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, I supported her because of all the contenders. She understood, had a record of understanding the importance of winning the cultural wars on gender, on race, and on colonial history. Nigerian-born, British immigrant, black, woman, on the British Empire, she agrees with me.
And isn't she married to a Jew as well?
Is that right?
I believe she is, yes.
His name is Hamish Badenoch. He's Irish. Maybe. I should ask him.
Perhaps I was confused with somebody else, but anyway. Sir.
Richard Stewart. I'm British as well, and I think I agree with you totally on Kemi. She's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. My question actually is more about New Zealand and institutions. So we had a few years ago Posey Parker being they tried to ban her from coming here to speak. She got here in the end and then got mobbed, and the police institutionally captured. as we talk about it, and they didn't protect her. Now we've got Candace Owens, the same thing going on. You would think with the change of government that they would have sorted that out, but now we've got immigration totally captured. So are New Zealand institutions, the police, the immigration, etc., captured in ideologically captured, basically?
I appreciate the question, and I'll take the moment to blow our trumpet and remind you that the Rapid Response Unit was to hand, and we were able to intervene in the High Court case, and that was part of why Posey Parker was able to enter the country. Just to clarify, that's not exactly what's occurred with Candace Owens. The New Zealand government and state at this point haven't intervened at all in her coming to New Zealand. Of course, in Australia, that is exactly what occurred. It's interesting now, though. It's a commercial question for her. Is it worth coming to New Zealand and flying all this way here with all her people for a couple of events if she can't go to Australia now? So the would-be censors over in Australia have actually really done damage to the freedom of expression rights here in New Zealand, which guarantee the right to hear opinions of people, whether you agree with them or not. To the core of your question, though, institutional capture is at the heart of what we're having to fight against. And the question, in my opinion, and others disagree with me, is not so much a left-right one. It's a belief in an elite structure of society where we have a lanyard class who are empowered to make decisions on behalf of the feeble-minded rest of us, or whether we actually still believe in the radical notion of the idea of democracy, that everyday people, when taken together as a sum, have a collective wisdom that is worth listening to. And unfortunately, across our major institutions, for a variety of reasons, it's a fusion in my mind of neoliberalism and hyper-progressivism, we are seeing these institutions captured, and there's a relative disdain held for everyday people, and I think that is what we're opposing.
Very good. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to our first panel of the afternoon, of course, Professor Nigel Biggar, Alex Penk, and Free Speech Union Chief Executive Jonathan Ayling. Thank you for your time up here, and